All right, it's good to see you today. Hope you're doing well. It's a privilege to have you with us. We're taking a look at the New York Jets again for 2019 offseason. Today we're going to focus on some guys that they may or may not need to re-sign. When you're looking at guys that you want to re-sign, these are guys that were on your team the year before, you always want to ask this question first. Is this even a player that I want to have on my team? Is this a guy, before I even start talking price or money at all, is this a player that coming back next year I would love to have or I would like to not have? And that's always the first question. Once you get past that, whether it's an injury question or a locker room question or a leadership question or a simply performance on the field question, once you get past that, then you can start talking money. And money is the determinant. When it comes to the second most important question about these guys, whether or not to re-sign them, and this is true for free agents as well, but it's especially true for re-signing guys, it always comes down to the money. At a certain point, the guy just becomes too expensive to be valuable for my team. So the guys we're going to look at today are guys that I want to have back for the New York Jets next season, but only if the price is right. If the price isn't right, then we're simply going to let them go. The New York Jets are in a position, and you can see the top 7 guys that I picked out here. Your list may be much different as a Jets fan. You may want to bring back some of the offensive linemen that they have available, or even a wide receiver or two, or perhaps a different cornerback other than what I've got. The advantage for the Jets this offseason is this. They have over 20 players, and that's normal for NFL teams. They have over 20 players that they've got to make decisions on whether or not to re-sign, whether to just let them walk or to make an offer at all, or to even try to be competitive with an offer. But out of those 20 players, other than the kicker, Jason Myers, who's at the top of the list, none of them are make-or-break decisions for the New York Jets. None of them are those top-end level players that really make a huge difference. When you put them together as a group, and I've got 7 guys that I think are important for the Jets, when you put them together as a group, they become incredibly important because you want to have guys that, even though they may not be lockdown starters, these are guys who could fill in a starting spot if they had to, who definitely provide a ton of depth for you, and who, in addition to that, even if you start getting injuries, these guys can really step in and start making a difference on the team. They are major contributors, even if they're not lockdown starters. So according to my grades, and you can see the grades right here that I have on these players, I don't think you have any A-list free agents, nor do you have, in my opinion, any real B-level free agents other than possibly Jason Myers. The only reason I made him a C+ is because we've only seen him for one season doing what he's doing. So when you take a look at this list, and your players may be much different about the guys you'd like to bring back, these are simply the 7 out of the 20+ that I think would make the most difference for the Jets. And they're almost all on defense, largely for what I think you can get out of them production-wise and value-wise. So, of course, at the top, you see the kicker, Jason Myers, who was an absolute gem and a real find for the Jets last year. Came on, kicked a real high percentage of field goals, was even able to kick long field goals. If I'm the Jets, he's 27 years old. The only reason that I made him a C+, like I said, is because we've only seen that for one season. His other 3 seasons really weren't that impressive at all. I would be willing to offer him 3 years and $11 million for that. If he wants to push to $12 million, which would get him to $4 million a season, I would gladly do that. If he's wanting to push for a 4th season, I would do the 4th season, even at a rate of $4 million a season, but I wouldn't want to hand out a lot of guaranteed money with that. I'd be sitting around 35-40% guaranteed money max for that, simply for this cause. He's only done this for one season. If all of a sudden he turns out to be a one-hit wonder or something, I'm not stuck with him for the next couple of seasons, or I'm not trying to take on a big dead cap hit if I have to release him. So I am willing to go more than those 3 years. I'm willing to go a little bit more than that $11 million. I would really probably max out at the 4-year, $16 million mark if I'm the New York Jets. I think he's very much worth having back. I think he could probably be your stable kicker for the next several seasons, but I don't want to hedge myself in by locking in a lot of guaranteed money there with that. So that's Jason Myers. That's my number 1 re-signing. The next guy, and this is part of, there's actually 3 guys here on the defensive interior. Even though the Jets were not good as a team against the run last year, and were not good on defense last year, when you look at the defensive interior, that's primarily defensive tackle, but that includes the rather large defensive ends who are not necessarily considered edge rushers as well. You had 4 guys who really made up a really good rotation of just very solid players. One of those guys, Mike Pennell, had a career year. This was his best year ever. Now, None of those three guys that are available here, you have Pennell, McClendon, and then down here you have Henry Anderson. None of those three guys are going to give you a lot of pass rushing. That's typically true for defensive tackles anyway. No matter what kind of a defensive tackle they are, you're not going to see a lot of defensive tackles give you a lot of pass rushing against the quarterback, except for those top defensive tackles that you see and that you have to pay a lot of money for. So when you look at Mike Pennell and when you look at Steve McClendon and when you look at Henry Anderson, you're looking at three guys who had very, very solid seasons last year. They produced, they were stout against the run, they weren't great against the quarterback in terms of pass rush. Henry Anderson provided you a little bit of that, but none of the three guys are really going to give you a lot of pass rush. But keep that in mind, for no matter what defensive tackle you get in the NFL, whether you draft a guy or you get a guy through free agency, unless you pay a lot of money, you're just not going to get a lot of pass rush out of that defensive tackle position. So, now, I put Mike Pennell on here. The Jets have actually already made a decision. They had a team option on him for 2 more seasons. It would have been $3.3 million this next season, $4 million the following season, $4.1 million, something like that. That's actually a really good value for Mike Pennell, even if he doesn't have the kind of year that he had this past season, even if he approaches anything close to halfway. Even before last year, which was a career year for him, he was having solid production in most of his seasons. $3.3 million and $4.1 million is actually a really good value for what he produced last season. It's a great value. Even if he reverts back off of that somewhat, the value is still there. Now, why did the Jets let him go then? Why have they decided not to pick up those options? Because those are actually very good numbers. He's probably, I think, going to make better money than that on the free agent market, depending on who else comes out in defensive tackles in free agency. Why did they let him go? The simple reason being that they didn't think that he's going to fit that new defensive scheme that they're putting in. Now, I think that gets overdone just a little bit. I think sometimes we hear just a little bit too much talk about a 4-3 scheme versus a 3-4 base, simply because in today's NFL, you don't see guys have to stay in their base defense all that often. It's a rather low percentage of time. So much of the time, you see teams having to switch over to 2 linebackers, 5 defensive backs, 6 defensive backs. Even the San Diego Chargers we saw last year were playing 7 defensive back schemes, and that worked very well for them until they ran into the Patriots in the playoffs. So I think that gets a little bit overdone sometimes with that 4-3 versus a 3-4 base. But still, the idea is there that the Jets decided to let Pennell go, even coming off a career year, even though what looked like really good value, they decided to let him go. I think, knowing what I had, I didn't have to send him into free agency and bid on him. At $3.3 million next season, I think I would have brought Pennell back anyway. You can always use a good run stopper. You can always use, whether you think a guy fits a 4-3 or 3-4 or not, you can always use a defensive tackle who is just stout against the run and who is producing, and who in Pennell's case seems to be getting better. Looking at the year that he had, you can always use a guy right there in the middle of that defense as a good rotational guy. I think Pennell fits that, especially considering that you have McClendon and Anderson available, possibly to hit free agency as well. So I'm going to go ahead and slide down. I think I would have offered that to Mike Pennell. I understand why the Jets didn't do it. You move down to number 3 with Steve McClendon. McClendon's a very different story. He's much the same player in terms of the fact that he's good against the run. You're not going to get a whole lot of pass rush ability out of him. But with Steve McClendon, you have a big age difference. He is 33 years old versus Pennell's 27. So I think if you wanted to bring Steve McClendon back, and I would be very interested in doing that, I would offer a 1-year, $3.0 million for McClendon. That's less than what he made on his last 3-year contract, but you understand that McClendon is getting a good bit older. Now, from the reports that I've heard, McClendon is actually a very good leader in the locker room, so I'm willing very much to have him back, and even to increase that number a little bit, I might push to $4 million if I really think I need him, if I think I'm losing Pennell and I'm also losing Henry Anderson. I don't want to get in bidding wars on any of these players here. I don't think any of them is worth actually getting into bidding war with another team on, but I'm going to be in constant contact with every one of these players, seeing who I can bring back either at a discount or at a very good value, because these are all players who have contributed. So Steve McClendon did the same thing last year. Very good against the run, very productive, a very good rotational guy. He was part of a 4-man rotation there on the defensive line on the interior. So I would be very much interested in trying to bring back Steve McClendon as well. I would start with the 1 year and probably in the $2.5–3 million range. I might push to $4 million if I think I'm just not going to be able to get anybody else back. I don't want to offer a second season to McClendon because I think at some point you are going to have that age drop off there, and I don't really want to have any dead money tied to that for his second season. So if I was going to offer a second season for Steve McClendon, then there would be no guaranteed money there for that second season at all. I would at least have the choice to cut him in the following season if we did see some regression here in 2019. Now, down here at the bottom with Henry Anderson. Henry Anderson is a guy who, except for injuries, has been a really solid player all 4 seasons that he's been in the league. Every time he steps in the field, by and large, he is productive. He is good against the run. He has shown some ability to get to the quarterback, not a lot, but he has shown some ability to do that. He's 27 years old, so I'm very much interested in bringing him back. 2 years, $4 million. Now, all of these prices that you see here, other than the kicker, all of these prices that you see here are actually very low prices. And for this reason, I'm not interested in paying top market value for a guy who may or may not even be a starter. I figure at some point these guys are going to be starters at some point during the upcoming season simply due to injuries or underperformance by somebody else that I'm counting on. But I don't know for sure that any of these players is going to be starting next season other than my kicker and maybe Maurice Claiborne, depending on who else we get at cornerback. So for Henry Anderson, I'm going to start at 2 years, $4 million total. That's $2 million a season, and I am willing to negotiate up from that. We might even get to 2 years, possibly $6 million total. That's about where I'm going to stop at. I think I'm pretty much going to stop there at $3 million a season. If Henry Anderson wants a third year, I'm probably willing to give him that third year, but I'm not going to go up to $3 million a season for that. And I'm also not going to tie any guaranteed money to that third year. So that's what I'm looking at for Henry Anderson. The reason you don't want to lose all of these guys off your defensive line, they were contributors. You don't want to lose all of them. So if you've got Pennell, you've got McClendon, and you've got Anderson, my thinking is you want to at least try to bring back one of them, if not 2 of them. I don't necessarily want to bring back all 3 of them. I think what you're going to see from the Jets, they have a ton of cap space. They know they need an edge rusher. I think you're probably going to see that at some point, either in free agency or the draft. I would prefer the draft. I think at some point you're going to see the Jets really address that edge rushing spot, but I wouldn't be surprised them not keeping Pennell and possibly even losing Anderson and McClendon, losing all 3 of those guys, and knowing that Leonard Williams is probably on his last season with the Jets coming up. I kind of doubt that they're going to re-sign him after his last season is up in 2019. Wouldn't surprise me at all if they didn't go out and spend a lot of money on somebody at defensive tackle. That just wouldn't surprise me a bit. They might even draft somebody at defensive tackle. I feel relatively comfortable in saying, and you never know, teams have all kinds of things that they can do. They might even trade back from that 3rd spot. I feel relatively comfortable in saying that the Jets are either going to use that 3rd pick overall on an edge rusher, which is what I would prefer, or on a defensive tackle. There's certainly plenty of talent there to warrant that on the 3rd pick. I wouldn't surprise me, though, to see them in defensive tackle go out and sign somebody who really has some top-end talent in free agency. So that's what you're looking at for Pennell, and then for McClendon, and then at the bottom for Henry Anderson. Now, closing out, number 4, Brandon Copeland, linebacker. Had a really good year last year, very productive. Played a position that really wasn't very familiar to him, at least when you look at the span of his career, and really produced very well. Again, I don't know that Copeland is necessarily going to lock down your starter spot. So often in the NFL these days, you don't even necessarily need that 3rd starting linebacker. It just depends on how many times your defensive coordinator chooses to opt out and play the nickel position or play the dime defense. So depending on whether or not you want that 3rd linebacker. But for Brandon Copeland, I would love to have him back for his depth and just for continuity on defense. He's 27 years old. I've got him graded as a C player. That's a fringe starter. I would start with him at 2 years, $4 million, the same thing, and I would negotiate up from there. I think I would go to probably a 3rd season if he wanted that based on his age. If he wants to push up to $3 million a season, I would be willing to do that as well. I don't know that I would offer $3 million a season for all 3 years, but for him as well, I'd love to have Brandon Copeland back. He was very productive. He really filled in at the starting spot for most of the season and did a very solid job doing that, so I'd love to have him back. And you really have the same thing for Darryl Roberts. Darryl Roberts locked in a role that really he wasn't expected to do. He's 28 years old, so I'd love to have him back at 2 years, $5 million. Why are you offering more for Roberts than you are for Copeland? Simple reason being that cornerbacks in general right now are commanding more money. The cornerback spot in free agency right now has really rocketed, and teams are having to pay rather exorbitant prices based on that. And so for Darryl Roberts, I'd love to have him back just for depth. I don't necessarily know that he's going to be a starter at any spot next year, but man, does he provide a lot of depth. And at 2 years, $5 million, I'd love to have him back. And I might even push to 3 years, say $7.5 million, or if he wants to keep the 2-year deal, then I'd push to $6 million. That's for Darryl Roberts. The last guy here, Maurice Claiborne. I am not a Maurice Claiborne fan for this reason, is that he has talent. I think we all know that Claiborne has talent. I don't think he's ever played to the top of his ability the entire time that he's been in the NFL. I think that Claiborne has more in him than we have ever seen when he's played in the NFL. Having said that, he's still a cornerback that is worth having. Now, over the past couple of seasons, you've had to pay somewhere in the $7-8 million range per season. I don't know that I want to bring him back at that price. He's sitting there at 29 years old. When he hits the free agent market, and I think that's what he's going to push to do, I still want to keep in contact with him. I want to talk to him. I want to see if I can bring him back at some kind of a discount. If I can get him somewhere in the $6-7 million range on a 2 or 3 year deal, I would like to do that. He's a guy that I would like to have on the team, but I don't feel great about him being my number one cornerback, which he's not. I think Tremaine Johnson is pretty obviously your number one cornerback. And I don't feel thrilled with him being my number 2 quarterback just because of some of the inconsistency we've seen out of Claiborne. Having said that, Claiborne does offer at least some stability there at the cornerback spot in terms of being able to hold his own at times and being able to guard people at times. So I'm going to let him test the free agency waters. If I'm the Jets, I'm going to see who else I can talk to in free agency, see who else I can get. I am looking for value. I am not going to pay top dollar to have Maurice Claiborne come back and be the CB2 on my football team. I'm looking for value, whether that's Claiborne or whether I wait about a week into free agency and I find somebody else that I can get at a value price. There's just not a lot of top-end talent in the cornerback spot this offseason that I'm willing to pay for. Now, you look at some of the websites that are addressing some of the cornerback positions in free agency. There are guys available, but you're going to have to pay a pretty good price for those guys. And in my opinion, they are not top-end cornerbacks. They're guys who, by and large, are solid cornerbacks with, in some cases, the potential to grow, but I'm really not interested in paying for potential. I'm willing to draft for potential, but I'm not too interested in paying for potential. So this is kind of iffy here with Maurice Claiborne. If I think I can do better, either in the draft or in free agency than Maurice Claiborne, then I'm going to let him walk. If I think that I'm going to do worse than Maurice Claiborne, then I'm going to bring him back at that $7 or $8 million price, and I'll just live with it for the next couple of seasons. So those are what you're looking at right here. Some of you may notice I don't have any of the offensive linemen. There's about 3 offensive linemen that the Jets have to make decisions on during the upcoming season. I don't have any of them on here. The offensive line was really bad last year. I don't think any of the guys that you're making a decision on are really going to help you if they come back. I think they really need to make a major upgrade at offensive line. I don't think they need to overhaul the entire offensive line, but I do think they need to get one guy in the draft, one guy in free agency who could really upgrade the talent on the offensive line. So for that reason, I didn't include any of the top offensive linemen in free agency that the Jets have on this list. So these are the guys that I'm looking at. I really appreciate you listening today. We'll see you next time. Thank you. Have a good one. Bye.